It's that time of year again when 444 municipalities in this province turn to debating their annual budgets. It's critical stuff, deciding where we spend our precious tax dollars. But how is all of that actually done? And what does the everyday citizen need to know about it? Let's find out from Enid Slack. She's the director of the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Benjamin Dachis, director of Public Affairs at the C.D. Howe Institute, and Jennifer Pagliaro, City Hall reporter with the Toronto Star. And it's great to have all three of you returning characters back to our little drama here on our set at TVO. Here's what we want to do, because should we fess up here? This can be pretty dry stuff, right? But it's important stuff. And Jennifer, I want you to start us off here and really go back to first principles and help explain what kinds of things are really involved in creating the operating budget for the cities and towns all over this province. Go.
So a city's operating budget is sort of the vital piece of all of this. It really is about our day-to-day lives in cities, how we get around, how we live, how our children are taken care of. And the operating budget is the part that gets debated the most, I would say, at council. You're really getting into how many police officers are on the street, how often your garbage is picked up, how often your library is open. These are all really critical things for us on a day-to-day basis. And on top of that, there is a capital budget. This is a separate thing.
Hold off on that. We're going to come to that.
Okay.
Everybody can't help but notice that the federal government runs deficits every year in the billions of dollars, and so does the provincial government. The city's budgets are always balanced. Why is that?
So there's actually provincial laws about this. The Municipal Act says that our budgets have to be balanced in our fiscal year. So that annual operating budget, there has to be an equal amount of money coming in that's going out. There's some fancy budget magic, which we can talk about, that you can kind of get around that. But for the most part, our operating budget has to be this balanced, full pie at the end of the day.
So if, for example, the city of Ottawa finds itself, let's say, $10 million short, and they don't want to close pools to make up that $10 million, they can't go to a bank and say, can you loan us $10 million just to get us over the hump? That's illegal?
Not for the operating budget. You have to figure out how to either cut the service or raise the money you need. That could be taxes. Maybe you raise the fees that people pay to access that pool to cover that gap. But those are all these choices that councillors and mayors have to make every year when they do the operating budget. Okay,
you've anticipated my next question which is all the money that cities and towns spend to provide services to their citizens, where does all that money come from?
Well, a very large portion for most cities come from a property tax base. That's your property tax bill on residents, so homeowners, business owners, and that all goes into a city coffer to fund these services that we all use. And there are other aspects of the budget, such as money that we might get from the federal or provincial governments, for example. In Toronto, for example, we have a rate-supported budget, so the money we pay for our water or for our garbage collection, and those are each slices of the pie that go to make up how many goods and services we're able to pay for each year.
And you said a moment ago, that's the operating budget, not to be confused with the capital budget. That's a different budget. What's that about?
So think of the capital budget as, if you're thinking about your own home finances. On a day-to-day basis, you hope you kind of have the cash to pay for groceries and your basic necessities. But you might be looking at investing in a house, or you need to fix the roof on your house. And so these are sometimes long-term projects, and the city has those too. They're just on a much larger scale. We're talking, tens of billions of dollars. So when you need to do road repairs, or you need to build a new community center, or you need to build a new transit line, these are all part of the capital budget. And in Toronto, every year we approve a 10-year capital budget where you can finance projects over a longer term, and they plan those out as much as they can in advance so that you're paying for those at an affordable rate.
Let me go to Ben with the next question. The money that pays for the things in the capital budget, does that come from a different place than the money that goes to paying for things in the operating budget?
It depends on the city. A good chunk of it comes from federal and provincial contributions, but a lot of it also comes from home buyers. Home buyers is they pay through development charges that are then paid for through development charges that go to the city. It's notionally on developers, but that ends up getting embedded into the cost of new homes.
Now, we just said a second ago, cities can't run deficits to pay for things in the operating budget. Can cities go into debt, for example, if they want to build a new subway line,
Yes.
or build LRTs, or put up a sports stadium or something like that.
Yep, absolutely. But
can do that.
there are debt limits prescribed by the province, and the City of Toronto also has its own bespoke debt limit, but they can go to debt as needed for long-term capital projects.
Okay, let's take the example of the LRT in Ottawa, for example. When they wanted to build that, where'd they go get the money for all that?
It's a combination of going through debt for financing. That's how they get the cash right now. But they'll know that there's in the long term property taxes that will pay for some of those costs. But a lot of it will come from transfers from higher levels of government and through other mechanisms through development charges actually can't cover transit, but other things like water, roads, that sort of thing come from development charges.
Okay, with all of this background in place, now we ask you the toughest question. You ready?
Thank you.
Okay, Enid, municipalities are constantly being asked by their citizens to provide more services. At the same time, of course, citizens don't necessarily want to pay more in taxation in order to realize those services. So we have a bit of a conundrum here. What options do cities and towns all over the province of Ontario have to realize more revenue other than raising property taxes on homeowners and renters?
Well, there aren't a lot of options, Steve. And when Jennifer was describing the sources of revenue for municipalities, property taxes, user fees, transfers from other levels of government, Ben added development charges when we were talking about capital. Property taxes, user fees, and transfers. If you'd asked me this question 100 or 150 years ago, I would have answered the same way. Property taxes, user fees. That hasn't changed. If you look at the expenditure side of the budget, municipalities are doing way more things than they did 100 years ago. Traditionally they did water and sewers and roads, and now they're being asked to provide services that attract the skilled workers. We want to bring the young and the brightest, and so we need cultural facilities and bike paths, and we need parks and recreation. We're facing an opioid crisis, that never faced that before. And municipalities, are having to deal with that. We're dealing with the impact of climate events, and how do we address that? So the revenue side hasn't changed, but the expenditure side and the demands people are placing on municipalities have escalated enormously.
So presumably, cities and towns have got to get a little more creative about how they bring more money in other than just hiking fees and hiking property taxes. For example, there are a bunch of ideas out there. In this capital city, there's a land transfer tax. Every time you buy or sell a house, you got to pay that. We used to have a vehicle registration tax. Previous Mayor Ford got rid of it. We have, came close to tolling a couple of the highways around here. Those are other ideas as well. How prolific do you think those ideas are in terms of coming up with new revenue?
Well, we are doing some of that. The City of Toronto, as you said, does levy a land transfer tax. I think Ben and I would agree that's probably not the best tax, but they do levy it, and it does bring in millions of dollars.
What's wrong with it?
What's wrong with it?
It works. It brings in a lot of money.
As economists would say, it distorts the housing market. In other words, it keeps people in their houses longer than they should be there. If I get a new job and I should move closer to work, I might not because of this tax. If I'm a senior and I should downsize, I might not because of this tax. So it impacts the housing market in negative ways.
It's also
very volatile. It's very volatile, and we've seen that in Toronto.
Meaning the market's hot, you get a lot of revenue.
And the market's not doing well, and you don't. And
Right.
Municipal expenditures are not volatile; they keep increasing, and we need revenue sources that do the same, not ones that go up and down. Vehicle registration tax is a fine tax. It has the property of discouraging people from buying cars to some extent. Didn't bring in a lot of money when we had that. We're talking about a vacant homes tax. Again, not a lot of money. The real issue is who does what. Really, should municipalities be paying for social services, which we do in Ontario, not in other parts of Canada, when we only have a property tax and user fees and some of these other smaller taxes?
I infer from your answer, you think the answer is no.
The answer is no. I think social services, where we're really trying to redistribute from high-income households to low-income households, the best way to do that is with an income tax. So either we need to have these services uploaded to the province that does have income taxes, or we need to give municipalities access to the income tax revenues.
As you look at City Hall right now, all of these other ideas besides raising property taxes, is City Council considering them to any great extent?
You know, they have considered them over the years, even as recently as in the last budget cycle. The income tax that Enid mentioned is something that a few councillors have tried to raise. They want to raise with the province either that we get a share of the provincial tax or that we be able to enact a municipal income tax. It didn't really get anywhere, and that's the perennial problem. You know, the vehicle registration tax you mentioned, it was canceled under previous Mayor Rob Ford. It's sort of, it's like dead in the water, if I could say that, at City Hall. No one wants to touch it. It became so toxic in the Ford years that we may have to wait decades and for someone to rebrand it, for it to be reintroduced. And that's a real challenge for councillors. Every time someone raises something, they're sort of sticking their neck out politically, and if there isn't the political will to do it, it just sort of fades back into the background.
Ben, in your view, are there any other less traditional revenue realizing items out there? In other words, not the property tax base, or not fees to go to parks or play golf or whatever. Anything else out there that you like?
One I'd love to see come back is the concept of road tolls. Road tolls have a great way of both reducing congestion, especially if you can do it on a dynamic basis, rather than have like a set charge of like $2 no matter what time of day. If you have a higher toll on, say, a Friday afternoon versus no toll or very little toll in the middle of the night, that's going to have a real benefit to commuters. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is going to raise a lot of money for needed infrastructure. So I'd go back to road tolls if I were the city, and they do have the power. The province has to enact a regulation to enable the City of Toronto to introduce a toll, but the city does have the power to do it. Well, ask for it.
We remember well John Tory trying to bring in road tolls on 2 highways in the city and being told by the previous Liberal government, no, sorry, you can't do that. And that seems to, I mean, if the Liberals wouldn't go for it, it seems hard for me to believe that the current Conservative government's going to go for it.
So there's another way to do it, which is rather than have a toll on the entire road, they can follow the American system, which is express toll lanes, where rather than toll the entire thing, they can just toll one lane. And that gives commuters a choice. They can either, if they've really got to get to the airport, or they've really got to pick up their kids from daycare, they can use the express toll. But there are also now going to be more transit available compared to what in the future, compared to when the Kathleen Wynne, the Wynne government, shot down this idea. So when the idea was that the commuters need to have choice. If they've got the choice both to pay the toll or not, or to take more transit, in a few years we're going to have that.
And let's just figure out how much money we're talking about here, because I think I remember when the vehicle registration tax was in place, it didn't bring in that much, right? Like
$60 million.
$60 million bucks, $60 million a year on a $12 billion budget,
correct,
right?
yeah.
Okay, so not very much at all. If you were going to do some of these things that you've talked about here, dynamic road tolling, for example, how much could it bring in?
Oh, it all depends on the price and how large of a scale. But it'll be more than 60 million probably.
It would.
Yeah.
But it has another effect, which is to discourage people from using their cars during rush hour.
What you want to do.
Which you want to do, and perhaps reducing the need to make expenditures on these highways if the demand is less for using them. So it has the two sides, increasing revenues, but also decreasing the need for expenditures.
I understand how a big city like Toronto or Ottawa, Mississauga, I understand how they could bring in road tolling and it might have an impact. Could you do it in a city like Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie or North Bay, and would it have any impact there?
No,
probably not.
I don't think so. I think this is a big city
It's a big city
issue.
solution.
I mean, the traffic congestion is a big city issue, and I think tolls would only work in the big cities.
Okay. All right. We've done pretty well so far. Everybody hang in there with me. Let's keep going, because now we're really going to we're going to try to drive away viewers in ways that you've never imagined before. We're going to bring a graph up here. And this is a graph that shows the comparison between provincial and municipal net worth going back back to 2008, the beginning of the Great Recession. And Ben, we got lots of people listening on podcast right now who can't see this graph. So I want you to take us through it, if you would, and explain what the two different lines represent.
Sure.
That we're either seeing or you're going to tell us about right now.
The bottom line of what it's showing is that cities are in much better net financial position than the provinces. So what this shows is that over the last 10 years, cities have been accumulating a very strongly positive net financial worth, whereas provinces are going deeper and deeper into debt. So the concept here is that if every city in Canada sold off all their assets in order to pay off all their debt. They'd
Assets meaning?
roads or local electricity companies or whatever, water,
Subway
water,
lines, sports stadiums,
whatever.
whatever they have, they own.
What that is, it's a value of all the things that people invested in. We're not consultants. This is just a concept to show the relative fiscal position. The idea here is that cities have a net positive worth, as of 2016, and the numbers are only increasing, of about $8,500. So every citizen would get $8,500 back.
If the cities sold everything they own.
Yeah, they're not going to do that. This is just a concept to show that they're in good financial position, in a good financial position. On the other hand, the province is if they did the exact same thing, they'd still require back from their citizens about $6,500 back in revenue. And the issue is even more severe here in Ontario. Those are the national levels. In Ontario, the dynamics even more skewed.
Now, what is the, okay, so the bottom line is you've tried to point out that cities and towns are actually in a relatively financially stronger position than the province of Ontario.
Yes.
Which leads to the question, so what?
So what? It comes down to these debates about do the cities need more revenue tools? Do the cities, especially in the context of transfers from the federal and provincial governments, do they need more transfers? Or do they have the ability to raise more of these revenues on their own, looking at their balance sheet, taking out more debt to finance infrastructure over the long term? And this gets back to this now I'm going to really scare you off. Please stick around, viewers. This actually goes to how we think about the capital and operating budgets, and the way that we look at these budgets skews the way that cities finance their infrastructure to make them scared off of financing infrastructure on their own, and instead going to the federal and provincial governments or to new home buyers for money up front.
Let me just understand that, because let's just take, again, in Toronto, what is it, $28.5 billion worth of subway and LRT construction happening right now? And for the foreseeable decade ahead? Are you saying that, and so far, all of that's being funded with assistance in the hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal and provincial governments? Are you saying the city doesn't need to do it? It's rich enough to do it on its own?
The city has, so transit's one example, water is an even better example. Where, I'm going to use an analogy to try to explain this. I ran this by my in-laws and it seemed to make sense with them. Think of two families, where you have one family, and they're growing families, they need a new house, they're a growing family, they need a bigger house. Imagine, for just simplicity, it's $1 million house, that's their only expenses housing, and they've got a $50,000 a year income. If a family was budgeting the way that the city does, what they'd be doing is they'd be looking at that $1 million capital expense and going, oh my gosh, I can't afford $1 million. That's the capital budget. Mm-hmm. But what they'd be doing is they'd be taking that $50,000 every year, saving it and saving it and saving it until 20 years later, they are able to finally put together the cash to finance that house. But by that time, the kids have already moved out.
They don't need a big house at that point.
They don't need a big house at that point. By accumulating all these financial assets, that's effectively what the cities are doing. But if you take it at the other end, what the provinces are doing, the way that they think about their budget, where they amortize their assets, that's how most households think about their capital expenses. Rather than being so worried about that $1 million sticker price, you worry much more about, can you afford this on your monthly or mortgage payments? That's what amortization is.
So in essence, you're saying, cities, you can afford this, but you're going to have to go into debt, as an average homeowner would.
Yes.
Got it. What do we think?
Well, I mean, if you really want to glaze over, what Ben is talking about is cash versus accrual accounting. Cash accounting, where you account for your expenditures and your revenues as you incur them. Accrual is where you amortize it over time. And cities have been doing that for their financial statements, not for their budgets necessarily. And it has really helped them to understand what assets they have and what shape they're in. And so I think that's a good idea. Cities still have to do cash accounting because they have to set a property tax rate every year. They have to know what's coming in, what's going out, what's the tax rate. They have to balance their operating budget, as we talked about. So they still have to do cash accounting, but they can do accrual accounting as well. In terms of the net worth chart that you had up before.
Sure, bring that back up if you would again. Top of page 3.
I mean, it's not surprising to me to see that chart because what is in there in municipal net worth is the assets that the municipalities have and measured against the amount of debt they incur. Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of assets. I mean, if you look at public infrastructure in Canada, 60% of it is owned by municipalities. So the things you were talking about, water treatment plants, roads, subway lines, all of that.
Swimming pools.
All of that.
Schools.
So it's not surprising, given what municipalities do, that 60% of the infrastructure assets in this country are at the municipal level. So it's not surprising that their net worth measured that way is high. But in order to be able to spend it, you have to sell those assets. I know what Ben was saying, if we sold them, this is what would happen hypothetically. But to actually get the money you need, you would have to sell some of them. The second part of that is debt. And it's true that municipalities in Canada don't borrow a lot to pay for infrastructure. Now, they do more in some provinces. Quebec municipalities borrow more than in Ontario. And I agree with Ben. Municipalities could borrow more. There are restrictions. Each province says, you can only borrow up to a certain limit. The City of Toronto, as Ben said, doesn't have that provincial limit. It imposes its own limit, which is even more stringent than the provincial one. But as you look at municipalities, with few exceptions, they don't come close to those limits. They could borrow more, even within the limits, than they do. So I agree on that.
Yeah, and it's so much easier to just ask the province or the federal government for more handouts rather than having to go back to taxpayers and say, hey, your property taxes in 10, 20 years are going to be a lot higher. Why not just ask for free money from the senior levels of government?
Jennifer, the chart that we just put up there conveys an impression that the cities are actually a lot richer than the provinces. Do they feel, I mean, you're hanging around Toronto City Hall all the time. Do the people there feel like they're sitting on a pot of cash and that they ought not to be bugging senior levels of government for more money for stuff?
No, they certainly don't. And I think Enid raised an important point about, the types of services the city provides and who should really be paying for those. That's this constant conversation at City Hall. So the city, Toronto especially, provides a lot of social services. We sort of had this outsized role in the region. We heard in a recent review of the city's services. And there is a feeling, it's a political feeling, it's a policy choice that shouldn't be all of the city's responsibility. So that's an important thing. But I think also when we're talking about the assets and what the city owns and potential sell-off or contracting out of certain services, that's a really, really political discussion at City Hall. It's a really hot topic. It does come up, perennially, like usually about once a year on budget time. And those are political choices that, certain councils or certain mayors are pretty reticent to jump into. And you have to remember that despite, what assets we might have or what choices we might have, it all comes down to a choice that council makes. And there really has to be the political will for them to do that. So whether or not they realize they're sitting on a pile of money or not, it really comes down to what they're willing to do with that money.
This may be a bigger question, but Toronto's economy is about the same size as Alberta's, or Quebec's even. It's huge, right? It's huge. We're talking about one city and comparing it to two big provinces, and they're actually comparable, which raises a question about whether Toronto sees itself as sort of just another city and ought to be treated as just another city, or whether it should have some kinds of different powers, particularly as it relates to spending and taxation and that kind of thing.
And budget presentation.
And budget presentation. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. How are they dealing with all those issues at City Hall?
We've certainly seen that conversation really pick up in the wake of the council cut that was brought in by Premier Doug Ford's government. It's really stirred this conversation, even from a grassroots level, about what powers the city should have. Should we be masters of our own domain? And we talked about the road tolls decision, for example. That was something that John Tory really stuck his neck out politically, and it was sort of chopped off a little bit by the Wynne government in that they then kind of reneged on whether they would allow Toronto to have those taxation powers. And there's currently a movement about whether we should have constitutional power over all kinds of things. That would require charter amendments. This is a very difficult legislative process, but the idea that Toronto could become what's called a charter city, which is that we would have sort of these jurisdictional powers over things like taxation, how we raise money for our own budgeting needs. And that's something that staff are studying. There are some councillors who are really pushing this, asking for council to actually make a decision about how to move forward, what we ask the federal government to do in that respect. So I think we'll see that in the next 2 to 3 years. That'd be a really interesting budget debate.
I know, for example, Boston and Chicago and Los Angeles, these are all big cities, city-states in a way, that are looking for ways to to sort of break out of their parochial old 100-year-old, 150-year-old rules around how and what they spend. Do you think that the rules around budget making for cities are out of date?
Well, I don't know about the rules for budget making. I think the revenue sources are out of date. Although Boston, is very similar to Toronto. It has property taxes, user fees, and transfers as well. A city like Chicago has 25 different revenue sources. So I think it's partly about powers. What powers does city have? Partly about the resources they have, and partly about their ability to make their own decisions without any intervention. And I think all of that is what's part of this charter discussion.
Now, Ben, you chimed in a moment ago when we talked about how budgets are made, saying that the way they make budgets at the provincial or federal level, I'm inferring this from your comment, are very different from the way that they do it at the city level. Explain.
So the budget presentation rules are from the 60s, and not the 1960s, the 1860s.
Where? At City Hall?
In City Hall, the concept of this cash budgeting, it's the old way to do it. The provinces and the federal government have all moved to the modern accrual accounting. If we had a budget presentation that matched the economic reality of the city of Toronto, of just how important it is, we'd see a similar system as what we see at the provincial level.
How would it, sorry.
So there are some differences between the federal, provincial, and municipal governments, because municipal governments have to set a property tax rate every year. Federal and provincial governments don't.
Well, they do through the education tax.
Okay, but generally, the HST doesn't change every year. That rate isn't set every year. And municipalities have to balance their operating budgets. So again, the accrual accounting basis has a lot of merit for understanding your assets, but you still need to do cash accounting at the municipal level because of those differences.
Let me put this to Jennifer. What do the people at City Hall think is the most misunderstood thing about the way they put their budgets together?
I think that when we talk about budgets at budget time, we're more familiar with the provincial or the federal process. We hear these huge numbers about deficits. And I think what people don't understand is that every year council is making a series of choices, whether it be all the way back to contract discussions about how much we pay police officers, which bleeds into how much the total police budget is, which bleeds into how much money we have to raise in order to pay for those police officers.
Police budget's $1 billion, right?
It's huge. It's over $1 billion.
It's over $1 billion.
When you get your tax bill, if you actually break down where your tax money is going every year, the Toronto Police is the largest line item.
Yeah, but we don't see this in the budget debate right now, but we see this in the financial statements. And it's a chronic problem year after year, and it's true across Ontario, but I'll use a Toronto example. Last year, the City of Toronto ran about a 10% surplus. If the province ran a similar 10% surplus, rather than the $7.4 billion deficit that we're seeing, they'd have a budget surplus of about $16 billion. That's a huge difference, but we're not thinking about municipal finances the same way that we think about the provincial finances because of the way because of this accounting. All these financial assets, money that's coming in, especially from home buyers, just isn't even thought about in the budget discussions that we're looking at right now.
But listen, I could be wrong about this, and you three are going to help me out on this. The way the province puts a budget together every year, it is done in the bowels of the Ministry of Finance. It is a very closed-door process. Yes, there are some public hearings that take place, but essentially, all the decisions are made behind closed doors, and there's a lockup on budget day, and then the budget is unveiled. I think at City Hall, it's pretty different from that, is it not?
It's almost opposite. It's almost the opposite.
Tell us.
So much of it happens in the public forum. There is an initial budget presentation from city staff. They sort of put things together to say, here's what we recommend, here's where we could go. And then there are a series of meetings over the next month. We're currently in the middle of that process in Toronto. And there are public presentations where people come and say, actually, I'd like you to fund my libraries more. And those are things that councillors then take back to committee and decide, can we maybe raise property taxes to pay for those additional library hours? Or can we cut something to make room for something over here? And that's all done in public debate at public meetings that are live streamed on YouTube. I think it's actually the best thing about City Hall.
Yeah.
Which process do you prefer for budget making?
Well, if you want the public engaged, the city process, of course, is much more open. You can walk into city council, anybody can walk in and watch the debate. So you do see what's going on, and that's not true at the federal and provincial level.
But that doesn't have anything to do specifically with the accounting. You could have an open presentation
That's right.
with whatever accounting you want.
What now? You said they're on cash. You want to go to accrual. What would it take for that to happen?
It would take a change in provincial legislation.
Is there any appetite for that at the moment at the provincial level?
I would say you'll have to ask the minister about that one, Minister of Municipal Affairs on that.
Have you asked the minister about it?
We at the CD Howe Institute have published on this for many, many, many years.
So they know where you stand.
They know very much where we stand at the CD Howe.
Do you know if there's any appetite to go that route?
It's really interesting where the cities are very strongly opposed to this. I've written at CD Howe Institute on very controversial topics, carbon pricing, the case for carbon pricing, the case for expanding road tolls. One of the things I got the most pushback from was on this topic, because part of this goes back to the question of, the budget presentation, changing the budget presentation will fundamentally, in my opinion, reshape how we think about municipal finances. Rather than cities thinking that the easiest route for them to get financing for infrastructure is to just go ask federal and provincial ask for federal and provincial money, all of a sudden it's going to be a little more incumbent on them to ask their taxpayers to pay for assets either through property taxes or, even better, would be through user fees. So these kinds of fundamental the simple changes in accounting could have huge ramifications for how we think about municipal finances and your property tax bill.
Let me ask Enid, in future, what significant changes would you like to see in terms of how municipalities function?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the revenue side, and well, we could look at the expenditure side as well. We didn't talk today, but a lot of people talk about finding efficiencies. And when you actually look at the City of Toronto expenditures per capita adjusted for inflation over the last 10 years, they're pretty flat. So we must think there's some efficiencies happening there. I think that the thing that people don't realize about efficiencies, though, is that you have to spend a lot sometimes to get those efficiencies. Maybe it's a new IT system. You have to put a lot of money up front to save a lot of money in the future. And where's that money going to come from? So I think that's one thing. I think we could raise property taxes.
Well, that's happening, isn't it?
We are starting to, both in Toronto, but also in Vancouver and Edmonton. Other cities are starting to realize the costs of not raising property taxes. And I think there's room there with a lot of public education. To understand what you're getting for your property tax, but what you're not getting if you don't raise them. And user fees, I think we could look at them as well. So those are internal things the city could do, but there are a couple of external things. The first is, and Jennifer referred to the region. I mean, we have to think as a region. A lot of the problems Toronto is facing because of rapid growth, those problems are also being faced in the rest of the Greater Toronto Area. And a lot of the services spill over municipal boundaries. You talked about social services. We can talk about transit. We have to work together as a region to solve these problems. And the third thing is what I mentioned before, is the who does what. I mean, going back to, and we did who does what many times before, but I think it's time again to think about what is the role of the province, what is the role of municipalities, who pays for what.
Like, should the city be in
social
housing,
yeah,
for example?
Exactly.
You'd say no, that should be a provincial responsibility.
Or at least the city should have the funding, the type of funding that is appropriate to pay for social housing, which is not the property tax.
Gotcha. Okay, folks, I do remember once upon a time on this program, we did an hour on quantitative easing. and this show rivals that for its arcaneness of topic. But I think at the end of the day, we're actually a lot better educated on what you guys are talking about and how this is all going to work.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things about accounting is that it sounds very, very arcane, but when you're inside an organization, the accounting drives so many of your decisions. It may sound, obscure to the reader, but for people inside government, accounting really, really matters.
It's huge, for sure. Well, we like accountants here. They sponsor our program. Certified Public Accountants of Ontario. Okay, that's it. Enid Slack, I want to thank you for coming in today. From the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance at the Monk School of Global Affairs at U of T. Ben Dachis from the C.D. Howe Institute. Jennifer Pagliaro from Toronto Star, City Hall reporter. It's great to have all of you around our table tonight here at TVO.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.